All right, diving in today, and I'm really excited about this one, art therapy, but specifically how it's used with individuals with learning difficulties. You sent over some really thought-provoking stuff.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating area, isn't it?
It is, it is. And what I'm hoping we can really get to grips with is like, the history, the core ideas, and then what it actually looks like in practice.
Right, right. And why it can be so, well, effective.
Yeah, exactly. So we're mainly drawing from Leslie Fox's work. She's a registered art therapist and has loads of experience working with people with learning difficulties.
Yes, her insights are just fantastic. And she brings in a whole range of perspectives. It's not just her own clinical experience, but she draws on research and the work of her colleagues, fellow therapists.
Right. A really well-rounded picture of them.
Absolutely. But I think before we dive too deep, it might be helpful to just quickly touch on what we actually mean by learning difficulty, just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah, good point.
The Department of Health back in 1995, they defined it as, well, a significantly reduced ability to understand new or complex information,
Okay, makes sense.
and also to learn new skills. And it often comes with challenges in, like, social functioning. And the thing is, it starts in childhood and has long-term effects.
Right, so it's not just about, academic learning.
Exactly. It impacts so many areas of life. But it's important to remember that defining it isn't straightforward. There was a document from ARC, the Association for Retarded Citizens, and NAPSA, the National Association of Parents of Children with a Learning Difficulty. It was from 1993, and they pointed out that definitions can get really tricky. Like, sometimes they even end up referring back to themselves.
Ah, so like a circular definition.
Precisely. Not super helpful, really. And estimates suggest that a significant chunk of the population actually has learning difficulties, to varying degrees, obviously.
Wow, okay. So we're talking about something that affects a lot of people.
Yeah, it's more common than many realize.
So something that really jumped out at me right at the beginning of our material was this awareness of, some of the assumptions people might have about therapeutic work with this population.
Yeah, I think we all carry biases, whether we're aware of them or not.
Absolutely. And it seems like there's this tendency to kind of devalue it sometimes,
Yeah.
Like it's seen as less demanding or less, I don't know, prestigious maybe than other areas of therapy.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the source even mentions a consultant psychiatrist who told a trainee that working in this field would be, well, his words, a waste of their
Oh,
talents.
wow. That's ouch. That's a pretty strong statement.
Right. It's pretty disheartening, really. And it shows you the kind of stigma that can exist.
So that really, I think, sets the stage for us to understand, just how deep and important art therapy can be in this context. It's clearly not a lesser form of therapy.
Not at all. In fact, you could argue it's even more crucial in some cases, precisely because of those societal biases.
Yeah, to counter those narratives. So let's go back a bit. Historically, what were some of the earlier approaches to using art therapy with this population?
Well, one that pops up quite a bit is the developmental approach. Stott and Males were big proponents of this back in 1984.
Okay. And what did that look like in practice?
Basically, the focus was on taking clients through, the typical stages of drawing development.
So like helping them catch up or...
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
The idea was that by improving their art-making skills, those benefits would then generalize to other areas of their lives as well.
Right, I see. So it was a bit like, if you can learn to draw a person realistically, then maybe that'll translate into better social skills or something.
Yeah, I think that was the general idea. And in a lot of the institutional settings back then, it probably brought a sense of progress, because those environments could be pretty static.
Yeah, I can imagine. So it was probably quite groundbreaking at the time, but it sounds like there were some limitations.
Right. And one of the big ones that the source points out is that it wasn't really connected to the deeper psychological models of therapy.
So it was more focused on the art itself.
Exactly. It was about those developmental milestones, but not so much about what the art might be communicating about the person's inner world or, their emotional state.
Yeah, makes sense. So it was maybe a bit more limited in scope.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like things started to shift with the growing influence of humanistic approaches, person-centered psychology and all that.
Right, right. And how did that change things in art therapy?
Well, the focus started to shift towards the individual's own experience,
Yeah,
their self-determination and their power.
so more about empowering the client.
Absolutely. And giving them more control over their therapeutic journey. It was a move away from this idea that the therapist was the expert and knew what was best for the client.
Yeah, I see. So less about fixing and more about supporting.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And recognizing the inherent capacity for growth within each individual.
And it's really important to emphasize that, the material we're looking at isn't meant to be like a how-to manual for art therapy.
No, not at all.
It's more about showcasing the incredible diversity of how it's actually practiced, right?
Yeah, I mean, you've got different settings, hospitals, community centers, even people's homes.
Right. And different therapeutic approaches as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Different skills, theoretical biases, the whole shebang.
It's not just one thing. And Leslie Fox talks about the influence of her own mentors. There's Patsy Noel Hall, who had a really fascinating approach.
Oh, yeah, she sounds amazing, very eclectic. She brought together like Jungian ideas, Gestalt therapy, holistic therapies, you name it, she was probably using it.
So very much tailored to the individual's needs.
Exactly. And she wasn't just limited to art either. She used music, drama, anything that resonated with the client.
Wow, so a real commitment to finding the right fit.
Yeah, I think that comes across very strongly in the source material. This idea of meeting the client where they are with whatever tools are going to be most helpful.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of how art therapy services are actually established.
Yeah.
Because, the sources talk about some real challenges, especially in institutional settings.
Oh, yeah, especially back then. I mean, the book describes the environment of this large hospital. I think it was probably Ely Hospital.
Right.
And the focus there was very much on containment, managing behavior, and using medication.
So very, controlled environment.
Yeah, very much so. And it's interesting because that kind of clashes with the whole ethos of art therapy, which is about, personal growth and reintegration into the community.
Right, so you've got these two very different philosophies butting heads.
Absolutely.
And within that context, this idea of speaking for ourselves becomes really important.
Yeah, that's a powerful concept. And it really came to life in those art therapy sessions because they became a space where residents could express themselves.
So a place where their voices could actually be heard.
Exactly. They could choose what they wanted to create, how they wanted to express themselves.
And that sense of agency must have been so empowering, especially in an environment where so much was controlled.
Yeah, it was huge. And the source points out that this actually contributed to the self-advocacy movement later on, for people with learning difficulties.
Wow, so it had ripple effects beyond the therapy room.
Definitely. It helped them realize that they had a voice, that they could speak up for themselves.
But it wasn't always easy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the residents initially saw the therapist as just another authority figure.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, they were surrounded by people who had control over them, staff, doctors, nurses.
So the therapist had to work to build trust.
Oh, absolutely. And the source talks about how the residents really yearned for independence, They wanted control over their own lives.
Which is such a basic human desire.
Exactly. But in those institutional settings, it was often denied.
So art therapy, in a way, became a space where they could start to reclaim that control.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
And there's also this clash of cultures described. The therapist trying to work from a psychodynamic perspective.
Right, which is about exploring the unconscious and all those deeper emotional processes.
Yeah, but in an environment that's so focused on behavior management and control.
Like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole almost.
Yeah. And it led to a lot of frustration for the therapist. This feeling of despair. And I can only imagine it was challenging for the staff as well.
Oh, for sure. It must have felt like they were speaking different languages at times.
Totally. And to kind of bridge that gap between the hospital and the community, the therapist got involved in some community arts initiatives.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and arts education as well.
So trying to create connections, help with resettlement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it was really rewarding for the therapist personally, but it also meant taking time away from the core therapy work within the hospital.
Right, so it becomes a question of priorities, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Where should the focus be?
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about supervision. Because the source really emphasizes how crucial it is, particularly in this line of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because it sounds like it wasn't really a thing in those early days.
I know, right? You'd think it would be considered essential, especially when you're dealing with such complex and challenging situations.
The therapist talks about working these incredibly long hours, feeling burnt out, resentful even.
And it sounds like a lot of that was down to the lack of supervision.
Yeah, not having that space to process, to debrief, to gain some perspective.
It takes a toll, doesn't it?
A huge toll. And the source really highlights how important supervision is for objectivity, for expressing frustrations, and just preventing that burnout.
And it's not just about protecting the therapist, right?
No, exactly. It's about ensuring quality of care for the clients as well.
Because if the therapist is burnt out, they're not going to be able to show up fully for their clients.
Totally. And there's another layer of anxiety that the therapist talks about, which is this pressure to prove that their work was actually effective.
Ah, yes. The whole clinical effectiveness thing.
Yeah. There was this fear of the department being cut if they couldn't demonstrate tangible results.
Right, because funding is always an issue.
And it sounds like that made the therapist quite apprehensive about using formal evaluation tools.
Yeah, because there's always this risk that those tools won't capture the nuances of the work.
So, again, that tension between the demands of the system and the realities of the therapeutic process.
Definitely. And it's interesting because the source also talks about the fears that some of the support staff had about art therapy.
What were they afraid of?
Well, some of them were worried that it would unleash all these uncontrollable emotions in the clients, like opening Pandora's box,
I see.
and that they wouldn't be able to handle it, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a valid concern.
Especially because you're often working with individuals who might not have the verbal skills to express what's coming up for them.
So it could be quite overwhelming.
Yeah, potentially.
But it's so important to remember that we also need to consider the perspectives of the service users themselves, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's crucial. And the source talks about an investigation that was done using questionnaires to try and understand what the service users thought about all of this.
So getting their take on why they might experience difficulties and how art therapy could be helpful.
Exactly. Centering their voices.
Right. And it's a shame that the source doesn't go into detail about, the specific categories of issues that they raised.
I know. It would have been really interesting to hear more about that.
But the fact that they were asked is important in itself.
Yeah, it shows a shift towards valuing their perspectives.
Totally.
Yeah.
Now, the source also talks about the importance of having clear contracts in place right from the start, not just with the clients, but with their carers as well.
Oh, yeah. Setting those boundaries and expectations.
Exactly. And it's not just about the practical stuff like, the schedule and location. It's also about clarifying roles and responsibilities.
Right. So everyone knows where they stand.
Yeah. And that can actually lead to quite a positive shift because the service users and their carers start to feel more entitled to ask questions.
So empowered to advocate for themselves.
Exactly. And to have more of a say in their therapeutic journey.
Which is how it should be, really.
Totally. The source also touches on this interesting point about boundaries becoming a bit, messy.
How so?
Well, if the therapist tries to offer 100% support throughout the entire session, it can get a bit blurry.
Ah, I see. It's about finding that balance between being supportive and maintaining those professional boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. And some clients might need the space to leave the room if they get overwhelmed.
Oh, for sure. That's totally understandable.
And something else that's highlighted is the quality of the therapeutic space itself.
Right, the environment.
Yeah, because it needs to feel safe and private. And ideally, there shouldn't be interruptions.
And that can be tricky.
Especially as services are increasingly being delivered in community settings, which are often multi-purpose spaces.
Yeah, it's not always ideal.
And for some individuals, especially those who really thrive on the freedom to experiment with materials, having a separate, dedicated room is just essential.
Yeah, definitely. It's not just about making the therapy more effective, but also about safety.
Right, for both the client and the therapist.
Okay, so let's talk about group art therapy. The source goes into quite a bit of detail about setting up a group that was specifically focused on relationships.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it starts with identifying a clear need,
Yeah.
and then sending out information about what the group's aims are.
What were they hoping to achieve with this group?
The main goal was to help the members connect their art making with their thoughts and feelings, and then use that to improve their relationships with others.
Okay, so quite a specific focus.
Yeah. And they also had criteria for who could join. They had to genuinely want to connect with others.
Right, so it wasn't just open to anyone.
Exactly. And they had this assessment period before the group actually started, which was really important.
Why was that?
Well, especially for individuals who might find the concept of therapy a bit abstract.
Yeah, it can be hard to grasp.
So it gave them a chance to experience the group, see if it felt like a good fit.
Right, so they can make an informed choice.
Exactly. And the therapists who ran the group, they were both working from a psychodynamic perspective.
So again, that focus on the unconscious processes and all that.
Yeah, and they had a non-directive style, referencing Hughes and Tipple's work in applying those principles within art therapy for this population.
Okay. So less about telling the clients what to do and more about facilitating their own exploration.
Exactly. And they also drew on Strand's research, which highlighted how group therapy can really boost people's sense of personal power and social awareness.
So building confidence in social skills.
Yeah, very much so.
Sounds like they had a really solid theoretical foundation.
Yeah, they definitely did their homework.
But the group itself sounds pretty intense, to be honest.
Oh, yeah, there was a lot going on. The members were sharing their experiences of loss, achievement, bullying, all sorts.
Wow. Heavy stuff.
Definitely. And a lot of the group's energy was focused on these ongoing disputes between members.
So conflict was a big theme.
Yeah, it was always bubbling away under the surface.
And how did the therapist handle that?
Well, it sounds like they focused on creating a counterculture,
What does that mean exactly?
Well, they were trying to challenge those controlling attitudes that the members had often experienced in other parts of their lives.
So trying to create a more empowering and respectful environment.
Exactly. But they also wondered, looking back, whether they should have been more actively questioning of their own dynamic as co-therapists.
Oh, interesting. Why do you think that was?
Well, they thought that maybe they had some unconscious stuff going on, countertransference.
Ah, right, where their own personal stuff might have been impacting the group.
Yeah, and they thought that if they'd been more aware of that, maybe it would have helped the members explore their own feelings about rejection and anger more fully.
That's a really good point. It's always a good reminder that therapists are human too.
Absolutely.
And we all have our baggage.
So the source actually includes some interview snippets from 3 of the group members:
Oh, that's cool. What were their names again?
Mike, Susan, and Anne.
Okay. And what did they have to say?
Well, Mike remembered Susan being really noisy, which he found pretty annoying.
Uh-huh. Classic group dynamics.
He said he generally enjoyed making his own artwork in the group, and he thought the therapists were good teachers.
So some positives there.
Yeah, definitely. But he did admit that the group could be a bit much for him sometimes.
Understandable.
Susan also talked about the noise, and she said she often felt like people were butting in on her.
So struggling to find her space. Yeah. And she remembered really specific details about the environment. Like the room being upstairs, the walls being dirty, the chairs being slippery.
Wow, she really noticed those details.
She did. But she said that talking about her problems in the group did make her feel calmer overall.
So there was some benefit there for her.
Yeah. Although she wasn't convinced that other people were finding the group particularly helpful.
Interesting. So her focus was very much on her own experience.
Yeah. Anne was much more positive about the group overall. She liked that there was paper on the tables and didn't mind that they were meeting in this old school building.
So different strokes for different folks, really.
Totally.
It's amazing how differently people experience the same thing.
It really is.
Right.
But despite all those challenges and frustrations, it seems like the group members shared a lot of their emotional pain.
Yeah. And that's really powerful,
And the therapist talked about how they tried to cultivate a kind of counterculture within the group.
Right, to challenge those controlling dynamics that they were used to.
Yeah. But they also wondered if they'd been too reluctant to ever play the role of the rejecting figure.
So maybe they were a bit too nice in a way.
Yeah. And they thought that maybe that had stopped the members from exploring some of their deeper stuff around anger and rejection.
That's a really interesting reflection.
It is. And the feedback from the members also suggested that some of them really wanted the therapist to give them something special, like individually.
Like special treatment.
Yeah, almost. Like they wanted the therapist to agree with them or fight their battles for them.
So a kind of dependency.
Yeah. But the therapist noticed that even when that happened, occasionally, it didn't really satisfy the members' deeper needs.
Right, because it wasn't coming from them.
Exactly. And I think it's really important to emphasize that despite all the communication challenges, the members were actually incredibly emotionally intelligent.
Yes. And the source really makes that point.
They were expressing complex emotions through their interactions and their artwork.
So it challenges those assumptions about their abilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And the noise thing kept coming up again and again.
Oh, right.
As well as the physical environment.
Yeah, I remember that.
Most of the members felt that Susan was causing a lot of the problems because she was always arguing with the guys.
So she was kind of the scapegoat.
Yeah, at least initially that's how the therapist saw it. But then they shifted their approach, and they started encouraging the members to be more aware of their own anger in the moment.
So focusing less on the group dynamics and more on individual responsibility.
Exactly. And it seems like the group members were actually pretty good at managing the conflicts themselves.
Really?
Yeah, they'd often step in and stop the arguments.
Interesting. So they had more agency than perhaps the therapists initially realized?
Yeah, I think so. And there was also this fear of criticism within the group, which might have been why some members were keeping their artwork to themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. It can be scary to put yourself out there.
Definitely.
So even though the term learning difficulty wasn't used explicitly, it sounds like it was kind of this unspoken central theme in the group.
Yeah, absolutely. And the source brings in some interesting concepts here, like Stokes's idea of scapegoating and Sinelsen's idea of internalized imperfection.
Right, so basically how people with learning difficulties can internalize those negative messages from society.
Exactly. And they end up feeling like they're not good enough.
And then they might act out those feelings in the group, you know?
Yeah. And there's this really powerful example with Anne's drawing of a smiling gollywog.
Oh, wow, that's a loaded image.
It is.
Yeah.
And the therapist interpreted it as reflecting Anne's own sense of being different and devalued.
So she saw herself in that image.
Yeah. And then the group kind of adopted it as their mascot, which is really interesting.
It's like they were all identifying with that sense of being different.
Yeah, and there's this tension there, because obviously the term gollywog has all these racist and childlike connotations.
Right, it's a really complex image.
It is. And the therapists also reflect on why there weren't many moments of genuine cohesion in the group and why the members often denied having shared experiences.
I wonder why that was.
It's a good question. And the therapist actually shares this personal fantasy they had about the group, about it being like a abusive relationship.
Oh, wow.
And they link that back to societal views around learning disability and sexuality.
So their own countertransference.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty brave admission, to be honest.
It is, but it shows a real commitment to self-awareness.
Totally.
Okay, so moving on to some individual case studies. The source talks about the challenges of diagnosing borderline personality disorder in people with learning difficulties.
Right, because the typical criteria might not always apply.
Yeah, and we get these little snippets of different individuals who were exhibiting, classic BPD behaviors.
Like what?
Oh, the eagerness to please, the paranoia, the manipulative behavior, the sexual opportunism.
So it's really important to be careful about how you assess those behaviors in this population.
Absolutely. And to consider the context, what else might be going on?
Right. And then there's Dylan's case, which is all about autism.
Ah, yes. And this section starts with a quote from T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, which is pretty intense.
It is.
And then it introduces this idea of autistic encapsulation, which was developed by Francis Tustin.
And that's basically about creating a protective shell.
Yeah.
Yeah, to shut out the world when it all gets too much.
Right. And it's interesting because Dylan actually had a diagnosis of mentally defective, which was the term they used back then.
Yeah, not very nice, is it?
Not at all. But he was clearly exhibiting autistic features.
And the source talks about Kanner's work, differentiating autism from intellectual disability.
Right. So what were the main therapeutic aims for Dylan?
Well, they wanted to foster his spontaneity, his independence, his confidence, his self-esteem.
So all those things that are often challenged in autism.
Exactly. They wanted him to develop his abilities, take responsibility, improve his social skills.
Wow, that's quite a list. It is. And they were also working on his self-awareness, helping him understand his emotions.
And all of that alongside monitoring his drawing development.
Yeah, it was a very multifaceted approach.
So a lot going on.
Yeah, and they really emphasize how important it was to keep things consistent for Dylan.
Like the time and place of the sessions.
Exactly. That predictability was really important for him. And they also recognized the importance of his symbolic expression.
Right, because he wasn't always able to communicate verbally.
Exactly. So his art became his voice.
And over time, the therapist started to use a more directive approach.
Right. So introducing different materials and suggesting activities.
Yeah. And the source mentions that there was research back in 1977 which showed that both directive and non-directive approaches could be effective.
So it's about finding the right balance.
Yeah. Dylan had this, obsessional behavior is maybe too strong a word.
Well, he had this really consistent painting routine.
Right, and he'd do these repetitive line drawings.
But then he started doing some really interesting work, these planned individual pieces.
Oh, wow. So his creativity was really coming through.
Yeah, and there were some student case studies done on his work, which was pretty cool.
And one of those studies, by Thomas, showed that Dylan was actually really good at relating one-on-one.
Oh, that's amazing. Because I guess the assumption was that he couldn't really connect with people.
Yeah, so it really challenges that. And it's fascinating because a lot of the themes that came up in his very early sessions kept reappearing throughout that first year of therapy.
Oh, so there were these core issues that he was working through.
Yeah, and there's this really significant moment described in the 8th session.
Oh, what happened?
Well, there'd been a break in the sessions, and when Dylan came back, he was really fixated on hair. Yeah.
Hair.
He started by cutting up this drawn ball of hair on his paper, and then he actually cut his own hair.
Oh, wow. That's pretty intense.
It is. And then he started doing all these drawings of Humpty Dumpty.
Humpty Dumpty. What's the connection there?
Well, the therapist interpreted it as him feeling really disturbed and unheld after that break.
Right, like everything had fallen apart.
Exactly. And they linked it back to those ideas of defense mechanisms and Tustin's concept of the autistic shell.
So retreating into himself for protection.
Yeah. And the source also mentions Rees' research, which is about how humans have this innate drive to make sense of things.
Right, to find meaning in the world.
And they apply that to Dylan's repetitive behaviors, suggesting that maybe he was actually trying to create order and predictability.
So not just being resistant or disengaged.
Exactly.
Okay, so next up we have Beatrice's case, which is really heartbreaking.
It is, and it really highlights the vulnerability of people with learning difficulties because she was raped.
Oh, God, that's awful.
And the source makes this powerful point about how their right to protection is often not valued in the same way.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's like they're seen as less deserving of protection somehow.
And the goals for Beatrice were all about replacing that sense of disempowerment with self-determination.
So helping her reclaim her power.
Yeah, and building trust. And the therapeutic relationship was absolutely central to that.
Which makes sense. After an experience like that, you need someone you can really rely on.
Totally. And Beatrice's early drawings of the assaults were quite detached,
Detached how?
She was using these simple matchstick figures.
Oh, wow.
And she was really angry at the teenage girls who were involved. She also talked about feeling physical sensations during the attack.
Like what?
I don't know the specifics, but she mentioned that afterwards she felt numb.
So shutting down emotionally.
Yeah, and she had this kind of detached wish for justice. It was like she was separated from her feelings.
And how did the therapy progress?
Well, she started drawing happy memories, which suggests she was looking for comfort and safety.
Yeah, I can see that. And I guess that's where the therapy space really comes in, providing that sanctuary.
Absolutely. But she was also really struggling to repress the memories and feelings.
So that internal battle was playing out.
Yeah. And in her drawings, there were these projected figures who would tell her to forget about it.
Oh, wow. That's really powerful.
It is. And when she did draw the assault again later,